morning. Thank you all for being today with us for this panel. You could see the panelists presented on the wall. And let's start just right away. So that the world is no longer the same place, that operates by the same rules, same principles, is not a news for some number of years. It's not the same place it was before the war in Ukraine, before the war in Gaza and wars in the Middle East, before Trump's style of governing, where he uses leverage against the allies to achieve his goals. So before we start talking about whether the transatlantic partnership is still a pillar of stability globally, I want to ask you, each of you, a question. Is there still international order, as we knew it, left to preserve? Rem, please, we'll start with you.
Rem is me, but I think you mean...
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
I think definitely the international order still is a necessary thing for the world. The Transatlantic Alliance is a necessary thing for Europe and the US. Definitely, it's not on autopilot like it was in the past few decades, and both the US and Europe, they see this alliance as necessary. For the US, the meaning of necessary is different than for Europe. For the US, it's essential, but for different reasons than Europe. But it's still, in many different ways, it's very essential. And the foundation of the alliance was based on security. Still, I think it's relevant when it comes to Russia as a main threat to both Europe and I think even in the US, there is an understanding that thinking long-term, Russia is a threat, even though we have seen volatility in ways people look at Russia in the past few years. China is a huge factor in this. Both Europe and the US share the same concerns. For the US is a major national security threat. For US is a little bit, for Europe is a bit different because the EU countries want to have collaboration with China and but manage their relationship with China in ways that it's not harmful. In general, I think we have to just look at the transatlantic alliance as we have to redefine it, and I think Europe and the US will redefine this alliance in the next few years. It might change, it might be different, 5 years from now, but I think the essence of it is essential. And international order, the big umbrella, I think in general, I'm just going to end here, but in general, is something that is evolving dramatically, and particularly because the US has been diverging from what we have been seeing, diverging from the rules that was the foundation of different alliances, particularly with Europe. The US has been undermining some of the international organizations. When it comes to democratic values, we are seeing very bad trends. So in many different ways, we are seeing the erosion of these type of democratic values which has been the core foundation of some of these alliances. But overall, I think it's very early to say that the international order is not functioning, or it's not necessary, or it's turning to something very different.
Kristen?
Well, thank you. I would add to that international order is not one thing. It's made up of a multitude of institutions, of a body of law, both by treaty and customary law. It's made up of practices and norms. And so, yes, the post-World War II and the post-Cold War order, they're weakening, they're eroding right now, but that isn't happening evenly. And so there are areas in which those norms and institutions and law are still strong, and those are worth preserving. And there are areas where they seem to be completely falling apart, and where then it's a question of rebuilding, or what is the order to come next.
I'm sorry for...
Yeah, maybe that's all right. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here, so thank you for inviting me. Just to add to what Kristen and Omid have been saying, is I think there's sort of three areas to look at and to see how the order is changing. One is multilateralism. I think it's pretty clear that the multilateral order, sort of the United Nations, isn't functioning as it was designed. I think the UN Security Council is in deep trouble. We see that with the war in Ukraine. We also saw it with the war in Gaza, that the UN Security Council isn't delivering the goods that it was intended to deliver. Secondly, on the trade front, we have a WTO, a World Trade Organization, but amongst other things, because of Trump's pretty unpredictable tariff policy, he's sort of thrown away the notion of most favored nation, which means that the United States is now in a different position than other members of the World Trade Organization that still embrace the rules and commitments of the WTO. So you have this sort of twilight zone in between countries that do still commit to existing institutions and those that place themselves outside of it. I think the third element is on the security front. I think there are problems with, sort of, as I said, the UN Security Council, but also at a more regional level. There are concerns about US commitment to NATO. Is it there? Is it not there? There's an element of unpredictability. There's concern about what's happening on the other side of the Eurasian landmass with China and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So these things are in flux. Just two points, if I may. One is, I think one of the big shifts is US withdrawal from a number of international institutions. Not actual withdrawal, but changing its approach. It used to be the guardian of a number of these international institutions. The WTO could not have emerged as it did without US leadership. Now the US takes a very different approach to that, and because it's so large, it changes the way international institutions function. The second element is international relations scholars would say we're moving from a unipolar world to something else, a transition. Could it be multipolar? Could it be bipolar? I don't know. But we are right now in that transition phase. We are in this repositioning, this reconfiguration of international institutions and how the order is set up. And that makes it messy, confusing, and uncertain.
Diana, what would you say?
I would say that there's not a lot to preserve in current international order, and I will explain why. The first thing is that we have a lot of institutions which are not fully functioning, and we can see that in the context of our accountability for actions, accountability for violations of international order, for committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, crime of aggression, or genocide. As these all institutions which were established, especially in the context of security, one of their main function was to prevent something that was happening during the Second World War, it's one thing, and the other to manage quickly the crises which appear. And as we see now, the crises are ongoing, the international armed conflict are ongoing, also within my country, and also we see the situation when it's not stopped. Why? Because from one point there is one country that can block the process, or there is political regime which is blocking the aid, or it's blocking the military supplies, or in general it's blocking some establishment of some institutions, or for instance, as we had a lot of discussions on this special tribunal for crime for aggression committed in Ukraine by Russia. So in that sense, I would say that now we see a lot of the problems which cannot be solved by the current mechanism that exists. In that way, we need to change the mechanism to adopt it to the reality, as I would say that they are quite old and they are not capable to handle what we have now.
Okay. You're saying that it is not functioning, and you're coming from Ukraine, and I feel, why are you saying all this stuff? But what we are having at this point, when the war in Ukraine started, there was a certain kind of unity in the transatlantic alliances, especially when it comes to defense and stuff like that. Now we are seeing this rift forming. How do you think should this affect Ukraine? And with Ukraine, the rest of Europe, let's be clear.
Yeah, the war in Ukraine is the war for European democracy in general. The rift which exists now influencing the way that the war is ongoing, and we don't foresee the stop point of that. Now we see the Washington, which concluded the agreement with Ukraine on extraction of important natural resources. And that agreement was supposed to be a security guarantee from one perspective, as was claimed by a lot of scholars. But what we can see is that it's implicit security guarantee, and now we are not having that much support from the Washington on which we were praying at the beginning of war. At the beginning of full-scale invasion, because war started in 2014, actually. So in the context of the help from the Europe, we see that, yes, the US is isolating itself from the conflict which we have now, saying that Europe should handle its own problems, and the problems is with the defense and security. And we see that Europe is trying to adapt now to the current changes, actually being left by the US. And from that perspective, I would say that now we see how Europe was dependent, the EU was dependent a lot from the economical part, on the Russia with gas and electricity, and from the defense part within the NATO, it was hard and is still highly dependent on US. And I would say that the current situation and the international conflict that exists can help to shift from that and make the Europe more independent and being able to defend itself and its democratic values.
There is indeed now a need. This was a deal, actually, that US was providing for Europeans' security. Now that deal seems kind of off the table. To put it plainly, Europe is arming. How can Europe strengthen its defense? And there is a need for that. And keep this NATO unity? Should it keep it, actually?
Well, first of all, let me say I do think that the United States is still committed to NATO, but I do think that the relationship is changing because also, first of all, repeated US administrations have asked European countries to invest more in defense and have done that in a way which Europeans sort of were able to sidestep. And I think what Trump and the style he brings to NATO has meant that he's basically had shock therapy for NATO, saying basically either you pay up or we leave. And what happened at the Hague summit, the Hague NATO summit this summer, is that allies committed to more defense spending. So they committed to increasing defense spending to 3.5% for defense, 1.5% for resilience, and that has to be delivered by 2035. So on paper, there's going to be a massive injection of additional defense funds from European countries, but, and here, we have to be realistic that the jury is still out to what extent European countries are able to really deliver on those commitments. Now, why is that problematic? One is Europe has to continue and double down on support for Ukraine. But the US administration has also indicated that basically it wants Europe to pay for the continuation of military support for Ukraine. So that's challenge number one. Challenge number two is that European countries are realizing that the European security framework isn't as nice as they thought it was, and that they need to really invest more in their own defense. So there's a double incentive to really ramp up European defense efforts. They can, but they're facing a dilemma. Do they either invest those defense euros in US equipment, making them more dependent on the United States, when the United States has indicated that it's more transactional in its relationship with European partners, or do they invest in building up own European defense industry, putting their money there, knowing that that also might create tension in the transatlantic relationship? So it's a difficult situation, and then I haven't even talked about the domestic politics of spending money on defense as opposed to on healthcare or education or social reform. That's the challenge that I think Europe faces over the next coming years. how to make that trade-off.
Do you think there is a question on the table with the current administration in Washington that Europe actually can choose? Or they have to just buy American? I'm sorry to be blunt.
That's, I think, a really good question. And different European countries will answer that question differently. Mm-hmm. If you look at the discussion in, say, Central and Eastern Europe, where also the threat of Russian aggression is felt more acutely, they will say we need to have more defense material right now. And if that's US, that's fine. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If you go more towards the West...
So the ones that think that they have still time.
Well, and also those that believe in the idea of European strategic autonomy.
Okay. Kristen? So how to strengthen defense? What would be your answer? And can Transatlantic Alliance survive the issues that are there?
So I think when we talk about challenges to NATO or strengthening NATO, there are two issues on the table, and I'll just build on what you said. The first is what to do about America, right? And the challenges that the Trump administration is creating for NATO, both I think in the long term, which transcends any given administration. So the United States has been saying, articulating for quite some time, that it is pivoting toward the Pacific and toward Asia. And it would like Europe to handle its own backyard, right? To step up, to handle its own defense, that it's been 80 years of reliance on the American security umbrella, on its nuclear deterrence, on its defense capabilities. And in that time, Europe has been able to invest domestically in health, in welfare, in the welfare state, and that burden is unfair. And Europe is wealthy and strong and ought to be able to take care of itself. That's not going to change, right? Trump, no Trump, Democrats, Republicans, that viewpoint, I think, is here to stay. And that does shift a burden within the transatlantic relationship that says this is going to be a new relationship moving forward. And one where Europe does have to step up and figure out how to manage its own collective defense again without the sort of American subsidy, you might call it, which has been substantial. Now, Trump himself and his personality poses additional issues because the way that he articulates these things and the threat of abandonment, right, if things really go sideways, does weaken NATO. Even the rhetoric around it and the doubt it places that the US will show up if Article 5 is invoked, that weakens NATO deterrence. Right? And a weakening deterrence means that we're more likely in Europe to have to deal with an actual attack or an actual threat. And we are dealing with attacks every single day. They're at the sub-threshold level, they're at the hybrid level, they're cutting of cables, they're drones interrupting airport space, they're cyber attacks. But the frontline states from the Nordics down through to Poland within NATO are all facing substantial operational attacks at the sub-threshold level every single day. And that is a consequence of weakening deterrence. Mm-hmm. But there's a third challenge that you alluded to within NATO of differing threat perceptions even within Europe and within European countries, depending on how close you are to that front line with Europe. And that conditions the degree to which different European states think that they need to step up and invest in defense and also invest in helping Ukraine fight off the Russian attack. Europe could fund the entire war effort by itself without, we'd have to buy military kit and equipment from the United States because we don't have that defense industrial capacity yet. But we could do it. We could fund it if we just got together and said this is important enough to all of us to fund it and fund it at a much higher level than we are now. And I think those are the challenges that have to sort of be overcome collectively within Europe, is to figure out the way forward together, given this new the new type of partnership we have to have with America.
Mm-hmm. Omid, you're from Iran, so my questions are going to be addressed concerning the Middle East. Because how are these tractions within NATO, between US and European countries individually? There are different views on war in Gaza, on going on in the Middle East, how are they affecting Middle East countries?
You know, I think you touched on one of the threats of international organizations and these alliances, and I think those threats are very real. And on top of all these threats is the double standard that we see when it comes to, for example, the U.S.-Europe alliance, international organizations, and how both Europe and the U.S. Look at the function of and the utility of these institutions. For instance, look at how ICC responded to Putin, and the war in Ukraine. Within a few months, the entire project was funded fully to make Putin a war criminal and issue an arrest warrant for him. The same thing is, something happened. The same issue when it comes to Israel. We see that one U.S. ally or a country that has a lot of allies in Europe has full protection when it comes to international organizations like the ICC. Or we have the ruling of 13 judges at the International Court of Justice, the highest court at the United Nations. And we see very little action by the U.S. and EU. I think these types of double standards definitely make countries, authoritarian regimes, dictators in the region much bolder. The entire EU-US alliance, except from the security part, has been about international values, democratic values, human rights. These are the foundations of the EU-US alliance. And once you start eroding and undermining these type of values, so you give a very open field to people in the region, from the Iranian, like imagine for years, Iranian civil society, Iranian activists, they tried to basically take the case of Iranian, those human rights violators in Iran to Human Rights Council or to ICC. In a few cases, they are hoping that, for example, they take some of these cases to ICC. And then look at what has happened to ICC over the past 2 years. This is a dreamland for dictators and authoritarian regimes. And I think these type of double standards, eroding the utility of these type of organizations, has a very bad impact on what is happening in the region. First of all, I think it has really weakened the voices of civil society. It has really made it hard for democratic voices to basically make their case in their countries. And in general, it's a very bad sign for democratic values, I think, worldwide. On the other side, we see because there is no, if these type of institutions fail or they don't function or they continue to have these double standards that the countries in the South see that, for example, when it comes to crimes or ICC, if somebody has committed a crime in Africa, right away there's funding for that. They go after that person in Chad, in Sudan and other countries. But when it comes to their allies, it's not happening. I think it really makes the countries in the South that it really expands the divide between the South and the North. So many different. To make it short, I think what is happening today in the relationship between the U.S. and Europe and how they look at these international organizations, I think, could have lasting impact on the future of these institutions.
Yeah. What we had as a recent development in the Middle East is that basically influence of Russia there is almost out. They have one ally left, and that is Iran. In their stead, there is United States, basically. Do you think Europe has a role to play in the Middle East, and can that role be indeed the values that seem to have been forgotten?
I didn't grasp the question fully. What's the question?
The question is, can the role of Europe, EU, in the Middle East, which is now not a very big one, basically, be in insisting on the values that seem to currently be sidelined?
That's a great question. I think that's one of the major to make these institutions survive and make it keep it relevant. I think it's up to the European countries to actually push. If the U.S. Sidelines a Human Rights Council, it's up to the European countries to actually make sure that the European Human Rights Council works and functions and has utility and has relevance. When it comes to other institutions, I think the same. The EU has a very huge role at this time and moment in history that the U.S. has basically pushed aside human rights values, democratic values, and for the time being, it might change in the next few years, or U.S. might come to realization that this is actually it's not beneficial to our national interests. But for the time being, I think it's very essential for the EU institutions, EU governments to push for these values and also the functionality of organizations and that are based in Europe. One of the, on top of the examples that we have here is genocide in Gaza. The fact that something so huge and profound is happening in the world before our eyes. A genocide, a televised genocide is happening before our eyes. And then many European countries even have banned people who criticize what's happening in Gaza. I think it's shameful because it was not supposed to be like that. And then again, people in the region see what's happening and how they have closed their eyes on something so profoundly, unbelievably horrific. And then I think it has a negative impact. So yes, to respond to your question, I think yeah, it's possible, and they can. And we have seen examples of that in the past few months by France and other countries to step forward and. For example, you saw France and the UK and a few other countries recognize Palestine as a state, even though it's not a very serious move. But at least there was a move showing that they want to change the equation. The equation.
Kristen, you spoke about the challenges in the transatlantic. What happens if the transatlantic relations don't survive this? Challenges. What kind of a world we are looking at in that case?
A very hard one. And coming out of where I live in the United Kingdom, where it's more than a transatlantic relationship to us, it's a special relationship. Yeah. And that sheds, I think, a window on the broader European relationship with the United States is, at least at this point in time, we are so dependent on the American military that if the U.S. did just not show up tomorrow, we would be in serious trouble here in Europe. And that dependency, that's on armaments, that's on ammunition, that's on weapons platforms, that's on the airlift capacity. That, there are many in a multitude of ways, command and control, intelligence, targeting information, right? There are multitudes of ways in which we are heavily dependent on the United States military, and the United States intelligence infrastructure. And that is a very, very scary reality when the US threatens to withdraw that overnight. And Ukraine experienced this, right? Trump wanted to put leverage on Zelensky's government toward the peace deal, and he withheld military intelligence sharing. That was on the order of days, not weeks or months or forever. But the White House used that dependency in order to try to extract concessions in a very damaging way, because that intelligence goes into air defense. So that made populations and civilians more vulnerable across Ukraine in order to extract a minerals deal. We are all similarly dependent on the United States if we were in a conflict situation.
Rem, what happens if we go back to what you said before, and it's connected with this question, what happens if Europe chooses wrong, this alliance falls apart, or the blackmail, to put it very bluntly, becomes, well, too much?
Yeah, so, I mean, first of all, I think global stability is served by having a strong relationship between the United States and Europe. So let's start at the end. And I think that that is an overriding interest on the side of Europeans, but also on, say, ultimately also the calculus that the United States makes. I think one of the difficulties we see now in the transatlantic security relationship is that, yes, Trump is very transactional. He wants to connect files, whether it's trade and security, but ultimately there are also voices in Washington, D.C. saying, look, the alliance actually gives the U.S. a lot of benefits, whether it's the benefits of being able to influence European foreign policies, or the benefits of being able to sell a lot of US military equipment. And I think ultimately that is a very strong sort of guardrail on avoiding the transatlantic security relationship from collapsing. I think also we haven't talked about nuclear. There is a massive dependence in Europe on US nuclear capabilities. And I think that's one of the big concerns that you hear in European corridors of power, that yes, there needs to be a rebalancing, like Kristen talked about. We need to invest more in strategic enablers. We need to develop more in terms of our own defense industrial production capacity for conventional weapons. But there's no way in which Europeans can replace the US nuclear umbrella. And so that relationship is going to be sort of tense, and also it's going to force them to remain engaged with each other. So I guess that's the premise of the question, which I don't really accept, that there is going to be a massive sort of divorce. I think there are outside pressures that are going to keep the relationship together, but in a very different way. And I think Europe needs to really be very serious about rebalancing it, because the current, as Kristen mentioned, the current dependency relationship is not healthy. Not healthy for a number of reasons. And I would argue one of the reasons, just tying into what Omid said, if you look at European foreign policy, where is European agency over the past couple of years? Where has been European agency in the Middle East? I haven't seen it, tell me. But I don't think Europe is really at the table in terms of how the future of the Middle East is being discussed or shaped. With Ukraine, I hope that Europe is going to step forward in a very material and very profound sense, because that is so integral to European security. But I think this is, and then I'll be quiet, but the multipolarity where we are moving towards requires Europeans to acknowledge that the world is going to be more conflicted, more complex, more uncertain, and that European countries and publics also need to realize that this also requires European countries to build instruments of power to be able to shape their own sort of foreign policy.
Diana, we are mentioning Ukraine all the time, and there is, of course, a reason for that. How do you in Ukraine view all these things happening in the transatlantic relations, because it is affecting your country at war?
Yes, it's very much affecting my country. In general, we see, I would be honest and direct, we see not enough support, because for us enough support means stop the war, which we don't see forthcoming. And also accountability, as I was mentioning at the beginning, accountability for actions which Russia is taking. The trade which is still ongoing within some EU countries with Russia, or the trade which is through other countries ongoing with Russia, some denial which we can hear from recognizing that Russia is an aggressor. We can hear that in some countries where the political regime is not in very much support of European values. So in that sense, it affects our capability to defend our territories, and we are losing each day a part of the territory because we are not on the counterattack side, we are on defense side, and the tensions which are between the EU and the US, they are directly influenced on our military capacity to do that and on our safety in general. I see that the EU has struggles with managing the threat which is near to its borders and the threat for democracy in Europe in general. And that's, I would say, that it's not about double standards, it's maybe more about how close the threat is to the EU. I doubt that we would be in a different position from the people from Gaza if we would be not that close to the EU, and it's the reality because we are a neighboring country. So in that sense, I would say that Europe has struggles with keeping the safety and security of the region. And also it has struggles with pursuing that human-centric approach, which was claimed to be the rule of law, human rights, and democracy, which are the key three pillars European values. I see that the ongoing relationship with the US, they can influence on both crises which we have now, and there are others as well, to which there should be a response from international community. And again, everything leads to the question not only helping to defend, but also putting people who who committed, who started all of that under the responsibility. They need, the justice should be served to everyone. Doesn't matter the part of the territory of the world where you are coming from.
Yes, I've been brought up to agree with that, to think that, you know, the ones that wrong the others should be punished and the justice should be served to everybody. But what happens if the bigger players in the world that is changing basically push Ukraine into not getting the justice?
Pushing Ukraine not to get the justice will lead to the continuous further threats for the EU. So if we fail, the European Union would be the next, because Russia will not stop on us, and they made that clear. They want to have control over the western part of the Europe, I mean the western central part. So they want to have the control over the EU. They want to have the control over the actions which are taken by NATO, and they were claiming that for a long period. So I would say that Ukrainian failure will lead to the threat to our neighboring countries. We have Poland, we have Hungary, especially we have Baltic countries, which are not that, doesn't have that big size as we are, as the Ukraine. They don't have that much territory, like they are quite smaller, but they experienced before within the previous century how the Russians can be, and they see that this threat is real. They understand that, and that's why I think that allowing us not to have the justice would lead to other undermining crises in Europe, and probably, perhaps, in the far future, it can collapse. The EU can collapse if it cannot keep the human-centric approach, if it cannot defend its democratic values, and if it cannot ensure that human rights are exercised, not just on paper.
I would like to ask you the same question, because we saw, as Kristen said, that, you know, Trump basically blackmailed Ukraine in order to get a better deal. There was withdrawal of the operational intelligence data, which was very dangerous, and I'm sure it costed some lives those 2 or 3 days. So what happens if, you know, we get more busy with other stuff and say, well, this war needs to end and needs to end now, and it's not a good outcome for Ukraine? What does it mean for Europe?
I think Diana sort of talked about made a very good point. That's not going to be the end of it. I would also argue that if a deal, a ceasefire is forced upon Ukraine, given the tremendous resilience that the Ukrainian people have shown over the past couple of years, I mean, we're approaching the 4th anniversary next February, the tremendous sacrifices that have been made by the Ukrainian people, that's simply also not going to be the end of it. I don't think a deal which is forced on Ukraine from the outside is going to be sustainable. And I think that's part of the process we're seeing right now, that if we move towards any type of agreement or negotiated ceasefire, it needs to take into full account the genuine, the original sin that Russia violated the core principle of territorial sovereignty, and it showed blatant disregard for any sort of sentiment of international law when it took its steps, not just in 2022 but also in 2014. Thing is, international politics is never over, right? So it's not like if there is one deal and that's going to be the end of it. So I really think, this is to your question, that Ukraine and Ukraine's position in European security, but also in European institutions, whether that's the EU or whether it's something else, is going to be one of the core topics that is going to preoccupy European policymakers over the next coming decades.
Kristen?
So there are many, many, many ways in which a peace deal, or what's far more likely is some sort of ceasefire or frozen conflict, there are many ways that could be really bad. I'll point to a few of them. I think the worst case scenario is if some kind of arrangement is imposed that would allow Russia to reconstitute its military forces in order to reinvade, right? That deal involves lifting of sanctions, particularly sanctions that are having a negative impact on Russia's defense industrial capacity, that deal involves potential territorial concessions, and Putin is asking for territories he does not even yet occupy, but that those territorial concessions create a vulnerable geography for reinvasion could be very, very bad. Or if the deal in some way restricted or led to a withdrawal of Western security force assistance such that Ukraine doesn't have the capacity to maintain its own defensive buildup for that reinvasion. Putin's war aims have not wavered, and they are maximalist, right? He wants a return to pre-Euromaidan Ukraine. So a Ukraine that has a pro-Russian kind of subjugated autocratic government in place. Ukraine as a democratic, prosperous neighbor is a fundamental threat to his regime. That's not saying it's a fundamental threat to the Russian people. It's a fundamental threat to Putin and the inner circles at the top of Russia for Russians to see a population next door that they don't even acknowledge as having a separate identity, right? That they make repeated claims are merely Russians. To see other Russians having a different style and a different way of life, and that's a fundamental threat to a dictatorship like Putin's, and he can't let that stand. And so what we have to be wary of when we're thinking about quote-unquote peace is that those war aims aren't changing. And so what are the conditions we're creating for a reinvasion, for the resumption of conflict later?
Omid, I would like to go a bit back on the Middle East and ask you, like, we talked about Europe being closer to our heart and where we live, and how this affects the European security, what is coming. But how this type of challenges affect Middle East? Is Middle East pushed into something that can bring, let's say, more dire consequences? I mean, I know that Arab countries are getting really scared at this point.
Arab countries are really scared of Israel. You see that Qatar, the government of Qatar, the Kingdom of Qatar, they have purchased billions of dollars of arms over the past decade from the US, and the US was supposed to defend Qatar, one of its closest allies in the Middle East, and then Israel out of nowhere attacked Qatar. Then the next one is Saudi Arabia. Saudis are purchasing billions of dollars of arms, and they continue to buy arms, and they are after F-35 now. Plus, they want security guarantees this time. And why is that? Because, why should I buy arms from you when Israel, anytime they want, they come and attack us? So we have a bully in the region now that doesn't shy away from doing anything, and they have justification for anything they do. And that's how I think it's going to be very costly for the US. If the US agrees, if they decide, if the Trump administration agrees to give Israel, give Saudi Arabia security guarantees, a very like a minor NATO type guarantee that if somebody attacks you, we come and defend you. That's the cost that Israel has put on the U.S. because these type of guarantees are not popular in the U.S. The U.S. does not want to give any guarantees to any of these allies, because if you give it to Saudi Arabia today, then the next day another country in the region wants the same guarantees. Pakistan wants guarantees, and then the UAE wants guarantees. And the US, and then the American public, particularly now that in the US we have this America First ideology booming, even from the far right to the far left. Both of them say, they don't want the US to get involved in what's happening in other countries. So for the Middle East, I think there is we also are looking at. We are seeing a transition, and then the countries are very much thinking like how we should protect ourselves from Israel, and I think the extra cost would be on the U.S. right now, and that's why we are seeing a huge backlash inside the U.S., inside America, against Israel. The general public in the U.S. doesn't want America to fund Israel's wars. They attacked Iran. Iran has a nuclear program that they shouldn't have. They shouldn't enrich uranium up to 60%, because you enrich uranium up to 60% if and only if you want to turn your nuclear program to a bomb. But what Israel did at the midst of negotiation with the United States, Iran was negotiating with the United States on its nuclear program, and then they attack Iran. I think that has created a huge sense of concern, and how the countries are thinking, like, except from Iran, like how they have to re-regulate or redefine the relationship with the U.S. The extra cost from now on would be on the U.S. And I think that's something that American people don't like it, and I think it's going to backlash.
Thank you. Okay, let's see if there are any questions. I would like to give floor first to young leaders who are with us during this conference, if they do have a. Yeah, I think you.
Sorry. I don't think, can you hear me? Okay. Hi, my name is Aleksandra. I'm part of the Young Leaders program from the Belgrade Security Conference, and I have a question to all of you or whoever wants to answer. So as EU debates strategic autonomy while still relying heavily on US security guarantees, where do you see the most serious risk of transatlantic divergence in defense industrial policy, tech controls, or crisis responses? And what concrete mechanisms could prevent those differences from hollowing out the idea of transatlantic relationships as a pillar of international order? Thank you.
Your question is for?
Whoever can answer that question.
I'll take a stab at it.
Okay.
If I understood it correctly, otherwise correct me. There are a number of areas where you can see transatlantic tension emerge in sort of the defense industrial realm, where traditionally the United States has looked at NATO. I mean, Madeleine Albright in the 1990s famously said, like, okay, it's great if Europe develops a defense identity of its own, but it shouldn't discriminate against the US defense industry. It shouldn't duplicate what the US is already offering. And there was another D, which I forget right now. And that has been more or less a guiding principle of previous US administrations. What changed under Biden is that Biden sort of said, okay, Europe, fine, you've been talking about a European defense identity for some time, show it, do it, have it take place. Trump doubled down on this and said, well, we don't, I'm paraphrasing obviously, we don't care what Europe does as long as Europe takes on more of the responsibility of defending its own sort of security environment, with the important caveat, spend a lot of that extra money on US defense equipment. We are bound to see more tensions in the relationship between the US and Europe on what does ramping up Europe's defense industrial capacity look like? Are we really going to see competing offers from European defense industry as opposed to the US? I mean, for instance, the US is still top-notch when it comes to supplying advanced fighter airframes. The whole question of strategic enablers, precision munitions, sort of the cyber dimension, that is where really US capacity is second to none. At the same time, drawing on the lessons from the battlefields in Ukraine, it's a question whether that's the technology you really need, right? So there's a lot happening in the defense industrial space. Drone technologies are becoming more important. This is where there are more competitive propositions between the US and Europe, and also other actors. I mean, Ukraine is going to be a massive supplier of drone expertise to European and US defense industry. So that's one area I would look at. You mentioned tech controls. I think tech controls is an area where you're going to see more US-EU tension. So we've already seen, we haven't really talked about trade policy that much, but supposedly, this is the reading from Brussels, that in the trade deal that the US and Europe signed in Scotland, in Trump's hotel there, that digital regulation was off the table. And then a couple of weeks later, we heard Donald Trump threatening tariffs on European goods because of, in his view, too stringent digital regulations coming from Brussels. And I think there are two important lessons there. One is a deal with Donald Trump is only valid as long as Donald Trump thinks it's valid. And so this is part of a continuous process of negotiating and bargaining. The second thing is that Europe needs to think very clearly and very strategically about which elements of its industry, its economy, but also digital sovereignty, and also values, because digital sovereignty connects with that, it wants to preserve, and at what cost. And so I think that these two areas are going to be points of friction moving forward. And the third element, if I may, is part of the US-EU trade deal signed in July was purchasing commitments and investment pledges. Sort of 600 billion was pledged that European governments or companies are going to invest in the United States. I think over the next couple of months, we will see the US administration asking European governments and companies to show them the money, like what's happening with these pledges. And I think that that's also an area where you're likely to see some transatlantic tension emerge, because the debate in the US basically says that those investment pledges are sort of an ATM machine that they can use to buy X, Y, or Z. Whereas in Europe, it's viewed as, well, that's part of our trade balance and the trade flows. So those are three issues I'd keep in mind.
There is a gentleman in the second row. The microphone is coming to you.
Hi there, Kurt Bassiner, Democratization Policy Council. My question, I guess, is for both Drs. Harkness and Mr. Korteweg. Coming from the wings of the panel who already introduced the topic of values, democratic values, perceived and actual hypocrisy in defending those values in the wider world, I want to ask about what you see as the possibilities for Europe in the transatlantic relationship of building strategic depth at the popular level in the United States, because I think they've really missed a trick on developing the constituency for the transatlantic relationship, thinking it was always there at the leadership level, and the EU and the individual member state discussions. And this also goes for Britain. I mean, the Canadians and Danes found the really hard way, that less was there than they thought.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Would you like to start,
Well,
Kristen?
I guess a place for me to start is that foreign policy played such a marginal, negligent role in the US election, right? And I was watching the election polls, the exit polls on the night of Trump's election. And when voters exiting polls were asked, like, what issues drove your vote? Only 3% said foreign policy, right? So US elections, what got Donald Trump in power, has very little to do with foreign policy in the sense that there's very little that I think constituency building could do on that big scale of kind of who gets elected to power. There was, and I think you're right, we did take for granted, there was a cross-party consensus at the elite level for many, many years in US foreign policy on the value of NATO, on the value of the special relationship with the UK, and on the transatlantic relationship in general, and on the value of an engaged kind of global internationalism. And obviously, the MAGA faction don't believe in that. I personally don't think they represent the majority of Americans. And I think one has to be very, very careful right now in this moment with Trump in the White House of doing any kind of campaigning, lobbying, or constituency building for a particular kind of foreign relationship that they would perceive as against their interests or platforms. I actually think that could backfire.
Yes,
Two quick additions to that. I think it's a very valid question. I think European governments and societies need to engage much more with Congress. Not just, of course, federal administration. Every individual European country thinks they have a special relationship with the United States. The UK calls it the special relationship. France always goes back to the fact that it supported the American Revolution with guns and ammunition. The Netherlands, in 16th of November, so that's 2 days ago, celebrated the fact that in 1776, it was Sint Eustatius, one of the Dutch Caribbean islands, that first recognized the US flag. We all have a special relationship with the United States because the US is a systemic actor and a security guarantor. So yes, we engage with federal administrations, but alongside that, we need to have much more engagement at the level of Congress, both Senate and House of Representatives, to talk about the relationship, and also at the sub-federal level, at state level administrations. I mean, you're absolutely right, Kristen, only 3% of the US electorate thought foreign policy was important, but on the other hand, economics was very important. And actually, European investment in US jobs and US businesses is pretty substantial. That transatlantic economy is deeply intertwined. And so even though we are in a moment of more economic nationalism, I think pointing out the extent to which the transatlantic economy actually forces us together, and if the US wants to get a grasp on cost of living problems, engagement with Europe is important. That resonates at the congressional level, but at the state level, if not even lower. Thanks.
Yes, please, in the middle row. Central part, gentleman in a white jacket.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for the very interesting insights. Pierluigi from the Italian Association of Energy Economists. I think that one thing that Middle East and the Eastern crisis in Europe have in common is the weakening of European supply chains. So my question relates to the South Caucasus corridor, as it is a very strategic one. What is missing from both a diplomatic and a strategic perspective to enable this corridor to see more infrastructure being built and strengthening the supply chain resilience? So what can the EU do in this sense? What can be done by Iran in a way also? What can Iran give up with, and what can make Iran feel safer in order to enable this corridor opening, and what's the potential role in China in seeing this corridor opening, and how can, for example, we see the defense deal between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia change a little bit the equilibria in a broader regional level in this sense, please?
And your question is addressed to?
I think Omid can be
Yes,
a good
please,
one,
Omid.
but everyone, of course, could answer
The
this
sound was
question.
not great. I couldn't hear completely the question.
You were talking about the disruption of trade, yeah? Because the sound is really...
Yeah, the South Caucasus opening, as far as the infrastructure concerns, because there is a lot of resistance from Iran in a way, feeling vulnerable in opening and enabling also the relaxation of tensions in South Caucasus. So this could enable strengthening supply chains between Europe and Central Asia, for example. What is missing from your perspective in the region to, you know, enable more trade to pass through this route, pretty much?
To the extent because I'm sure it's a great question, but the sound I cannot hear you very well. But it's about the role of the EU in somehow managing countries like Iran, countries that have impact in the South Caucasus, and how they can manage their role in these areas. Was that the question? You know, again, I wish we had enough time to discuss the impact of different sides of double standards when it comes to values. Because I still think, you know, even the EU, and as you mentioned, as Kristen mentioned, the EU and the US have not backed Ukraine enough. They could really stop this, you know, if they wanted, for different reasons. But my question, the double standard was for another issue. I think the EU has not been able to, when it comes to countries like Iran, or as you mentioned about how the EU doesn't have much presence in the Middle East when it comes to different sort of policies. The EU has always moved behind the US when it comes to the Middle East. In particular, when it comes to Iran, on many different fronts, the EU has been under the influence of the US, and so has not been able to manage properly its relationship with the country. And so yes, Iran has, over the past 10, 15 years, has become much closer to Russia and China. This is a good portion of the population in the country do not appreciate that the leadership of Iran is siding with Russia in the war with Ukraine. A good portion of the country. And there is a popular support for getting closer to Europe and the US. But over the past 2 decades, the EU has been a bystander when it comes to Iran and has led the US to manage the relationship. And we, after 2 decades, we know where we are now. We are at this, there's a ceasefire now between Iran, Israel, and the US. Yeah. And in that sense, I think the EU could have a much stronger, much more creative role in basically dealing with countries like Iran, and that would have definitely affected what Iran does with China and Russia. I think the economic sanctions on Iran in the past few decades has definitely pushed Iranians towards China. And again, they can't rely on the US and EU because of many different reasons. But as you probably know, yeah.
Sorry, we are very much in red, so we'll have to continue on the coffee break, and there are many more panels to come. Thank you all for participating in this panel today, and thank you all for being today with us.
Thank you.